Those fingers in my hair, that sly come hither stare, that strips my conscience bare, it's witchcraft. And I've got no defense for it, the heat is too intense for it. What good would common sense for it do? 'Cause it's witchcraft, wicked witchcraft. And although I know it's strictly taboo,
the ultimate terror is about your own identity. Life and death, that's a piece of cake. Your identity, that is a problem. And you hold up your hand and say, whose hand is this I see before me? That is very bothersome. And a child is just starting to figure out its body, you know, getting used to the fact that it's in this mortal body, and a child has to learn the concept of mortality. And then just when you have figured out how to be a child, along comes puberty. All the rules are out. You have to start all over again. And then you have even greater problems to deal with concerning the body. And here's the Frankenstein monster addressing issues about the body that you definitely don't want to think about.
You can't say no to the beauty and the beast.
Well, I first encountered the Frankenstein story
as an idea.
As a kid growing up,
reading the Famous Monsters magazine.
We usually think that the monster is called
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
Victor Frankenstein.
I always get confused between Victor
and the creature
that has been created by
Dr. Frankenstein.
Victor Frankenstein is
the creature.
I know that's what I thought when I was a kid.
Had seen some films, had heard the stories.
I did see several films.
You're 5 years old. It comes on television. It's the old
Boris Karloff, Frankenstein.
Magic happened in the 31 film. And your life has changed forever.
At some point when I was, I think, a teenager.
I read the Frankenstein novel.
I'm not sure how much I got out of it at the time, but
I really didn't want to have anything to do with Frankenstein.
The first reading of Frankenstein, I think I was most interested in Victor.
I didn't come to the actual novel
until I seen the movie recently. And I'd heard some friends talk about the book.
There are very few people in today's world who would have read the novel before they see one of the films.
It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Oh, yes, indeed. I'll never forget Christmas Day, 1931. I didn't know what I was getting into. It'd be a year till I would read the actual novel, which was serialized in a publication called Weird Tales. But when I got to the theater, there was an ambulance in front, and that was a little disquieting. Then I got inside, and there were nurses in attendance. And in the middle of the movie, a lady on the aisle screamed, jumped up, ran up the aisle. Well, of course, that terrified the entire audience. I liked the film so much that I stayed to see it again. And oddly enough, the same moment in the film, the same lady in the same aisle jumped and ran up. And, of course, years later, when I was more sophisticated, I realized that that was all a part of the publicity, including the ambulance, and the nurses probably were just unemployed extras.
Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy?
Virtual reality is technology for creating computer simulations of worlds or environments which people can enter into or interact with.
I suppose I'm interested in the way in which Frankenstein is realistic, but not in the usual sense of realism. That is, we don't get a lot of details about Victor Frankenstein's workshop of filthy creation. We know more about what it might have looked like from the movies. But at the same time, the book has a kind of psychological authenticity, which is overwhelming. So maybe I'd call it a psychological novel, or I'd call it well, I mean, it is what you call a gothic fantasy. I'd call it a fantasy about consciousness and about creation.
It is a Gothic novel. That genre existed before Mary Shelley, going back to the Castle of Otranto. It's a work of romanticism in the same sense that Lord Byron and Percy Shelley were doing the romantic poetry and dealing with similar themes to Mary Shelley. It's romantic work. But it's also proto-science fiction.
Not only is there this virtual world, but that people can get into that world as well. So you might put on goggles or some other capability that makes it so you see or sense that imaginary world rather than the real world.
But there is a bare bones quality to Frankenstein that makes it like unto a fable. And I think we respond immediately to it, and we respond in different ways. That is, our various dispositions allow us to see the monster in different ways.
I think this novel is a journey into the heart of ice and into an icy heart.
It's cold
It was very striking to me and my collaborator, Susan Kubar, when we were teaching it for the first time, that Frankenstein fit extraordinarily well into a kind of what we began to see as a pattern of themes created by the female imagination in the 19th century. Over and over again, women writers imagine what their male counterparts might think of as the sublime, as a kind of desolate, icy, terrifying, bleak landscape over which it is impossible to have any control. And if you think about the landscape that frames Frankenstein, the landscape in which Walton, who is himself a quite important character, encounters the creator and his creature, and the landscape into which the creator and his creature disappear at the end of the book, it seems to me that's an extraordinarily vivid example of a kind of landscape on which women writers did brood throughout the 19th century and even on into the 20th century.
Don't forget your mitten.
I think that many of the world's greatest books have flaws, and those flaws are part of what makes them great.
I don't believe that you can read it today without bearing in mind when it was written. Certainly by contemporary storytelling standards, the book is a little clunky. I mean, there's a section of it where she goes off on a travel log. It's just like, oh, now I'm in Scotland. I'm taking a vacation. We're putting the story aside for a while, and we're just going places. A good friend of mine because I've always wondered about that myself, a good friend of mine pointed out that back in those days, the novel was the most, it was the way to reach the widest possible audience, and the novel was the only way people could go on tours of the world. People really didn't get a chance to travel back then. They couldn't just jump on a plane and go somewhere. They certainly didn't have VCRs, you know, they couldn't see what Tahiti looked like. So the authors would take them on these tours, and they'd have to use their imaginations to visualize these places.
I think the novel opens itself to interpretation by the very fact that it's so incredibly badly written, that Shelley suddenly hits upon an idea that she wants to explore, so she shoves it in, like the Turks bit with Safi and the bits in Ireland, and so all of a sudden you're somewhere or something's happening that is really quite irrelevant.
Well, I don't think it is clumsily written. There are a few scenes that cause critics some concern. For example, the way in which the monster learns to read. There's another so-called weak moment when Victor does not anticipate that the monster will kill Elizabeth. The monster has told Victor that he will be with him on his wedding night. Victor assumes, because of his egoism, and also because he's never read novels and he doesn't understand what poetic justice is, Victor assumes that the monster will be coming to destroy him, whereas we as the readers know that the monster will come and destroy Elizabeth.
The ironies in that book, the lost opportunities, you know, the lost moments, the little moments that just got away from you, and that's why everything turned so tragic. Like, Oh, those are the ironies you pray to achieve, when you're writing a book or a screenplay. It's the thing that makes the viewer or the reader go, "Oh no! Oh geez! Oh, why'd that happen? I love that happened because it surprised me. But why'd that happen? She did that so well. She did that so well. And Dickens is another one who's like, those little moments that just go, "Oh no! How'd that get away?" That's why they're such great storytellers.
When I'm reading the novel and the descriptions of the landscape, it's like reading a river as you're going down it and being able to tell the signs, or when you're flying over landscapes and you can read where paths are.
It's constructed with extraordinary artfulness, like those Russian dolls that are dolls within dolls, or like a pregnant woman with a womb inside her, and inside the womb a baby, and inside the baby the potential for more babies. I can't understand how anybody could not think it's well written. It's also very moving. As a young girl with literary ambitions and talents, and with a mother who was a famous literary woman and feminist, and a father who was a famous philosopher and feminist, she was very concerned with issues having to do with female creativity and female procreativity, how they fit together, how they don't fit together, what the horror of biological creation is. Is it a filthy horror, or is it a healthy accomplishment? And what the horror of female literary creation might be. Is that a filthy horror? Was it a filthy horror for her to even attempt, as the wife of an aspiring poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, one of the great romantic poets, was it a filthy horror for her to even attempt to rival his kinds of efforts at creation?
Walton is creating a journal within 9 months' time, at the same time that Victor Frankenstein is creating a monster. So the journal and the monster are parallel. Parallel even to that is the very novel that Mary Shelley herself is writing, because it takes her 9 months to write the novel. But we find in the 1831 preface that Mary Shelley bids her novel to go forth and prosper, and she calls her novel itself a hideous progeny.
I think the key point in the narrative is when the creature is born, and I think he is born, and he is rejected by his father.
His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips.
Well, Victor reacted very violently. He couldn't stand the appearance of the creature.
One of the reasons the monster is ugly is that he externalizes Victor Frankenstein's own psychological ugliness at the moment that he creates the monster.
After Victor has created him, he's repulsed by him, which leaves me to think he's repulsed by something within himself. And he's projecting it onto the physical makeup of the monster.
The creature opens its watery eye, and the gaze of the creator meets the gaze of the creature, and the creator looks down on his creation and abandons it. And really, in a sense, this is almost like a fantasy of abandoning a baby.
But once he creates his monster, or his creation, he turns against it, which is his crime. It is a parent rejecting his child.
What is the responsibility of a person who brings a life into this world? What is your moral and ethical responsibility toward that life?
we cannot really blame him for abandoning the creature. He was never brought up to tolerate ugliness, to tolerate faulty workmanship. He is a well-brought-up young man who is studying science. He has never had a course in ethics or philosophy or history, and he's making something new.
We're dealing with, thematically, a guy who's trying to create life, but he's so caught up in his own egocentricity that he doesn't bother creating life the obvious way. I mean, there is the woman with whom he can create life, and he forsakes that. That's just something very compelling, I think, about men.
The monster lacks a mother, but he is not the only one. Victor is motherless. The DeLacy cottage has no mother in it. Safie's mother is dead. Walton's mother does not exist. Mary Shelley wants us to see these parallels, to ask the questions, and to see all of us, as it were, like she is a child of a family in which there is no mother. She has a stepmother, but of course Mary Wollstonecraft, her own mother, died 10 days after Mary Shelley was born.
Tell me about your childhood.
I'm like a father or a mother figure because I build these things, I birth them, basically, part by part, and then I completely have to work for them. They won't work unless I continually service them, so it's like changing their diapers or feeding them. If I have an exhibition, it's a commitment to keep them alive. And if I don't keep them alive, the work dies. When I first create one of these sculptures, I come up with an image, and the image is related always to a name because it's going through some kind of action. The Tumbling Man is extremely loud, but the idea of a very heavy piece of machinery actually just tumbling, to me, is a very peaceful, calm action. But as it tumbles, it's a cacophony of noise, you know. And people have a very intense reaction, like it's going to smash them or it's going to hurt them, or they're alarmed, but it's really quite amazing to have them have this. They get pulled into the Tumbling Man and they begin to feel pity for it because, in fact, it's struggling to just do something that they've done before, which is just to tumble.
The monster means well, is like an incredibly sweet, smart kid who wants help and who doesn't get it.
The reason children fear him is because of his capacity for being such a bad kid, you know, for having such a wild tantrum, you know, and that's kind of scary.
In our culture, we had what you would call a wittigu, and he was like Frankenstein. We were told that he was evil and mean, and that if we were bad and this and that he would eat us up and stuff like that. And I was scared of this wittigu. And then again, I wasn't scared of him. I thought about what a wittigu was, and I would have liked to have seen a wittigu, you know, and I never did. But like a friend of mine was telling me that the wittigu is a human being, a cannibal. And I don't know how he gets to be this way, but he is created.
Some of the sculptures particularly are about being very, very elegant. The urge to stand figure on the globe there was a real importance in making it very elegant, very streamlined. Whereas the horny children were about a very simple gesture, something as crude as a drawing to depict the very idea. When you're a kid and you're quite young, kids will tease you in any way they can, you know. So, you know, Francisco is my given name, and so they just sort of, you know, started calling me Francisco Stein. Of course, I sort of played that out, you know, I just sort of played that character a little bit, you know, because It's kind of, if kids mess with you, you sort of just try to mess with them back, and sort of like throwing it back at them.
And when somebody accuses somebody else of being a real Frankenstein, usually that person is calling the other person bad and evil and monstrous, and working off an idea fostered usually by Frankenstein movies and by monster movies in general, that the monstrous other really is monstrous, that there is no discrepancy between the monstrosity of the exterior and a monstrous spirit within. In fact, usually such people are working from the idea that just as the name Frankenstein signifies the monster created by Victor Frankenstein, so the monster's monstrous exterior signifies a monstrous soul.
Karloff's version of the monster is very sympathetic, and that's what actually really attracted me to it. It isn't just this hulking beast that, you know, is going around, you know, murdering people for no reason. I mean, that you really kind of see that the sympathy there, you know, and you have a lot of compassion for this creature, and he didn't ask to be put in this situation, and he didn't ask to have this ridiculous flat head and the electrodes in his neck, and yet he has to pay the price of his looks, you know. And that's something that I found fascinating just about what I do in general, and makeup in general, and the fact that how you appear to someone really affects how they respond to you.
Today, I think we would look at such a creature and we would marvel at it. We would not be horrified, because through computer games and through science fiction and through science fiction illustration and comic strips, we have seen monstrosities far greater that are absolutely acceptable.
The monster perceived himself beautiful until he actually was reflected by something else, and actually saw his reflection or was reflected by Victor, and then reacted to his reaction. And I find that people are always sort of dealing with that in our society, of what do I look like? Do I look good enough? Am I working out enough so that you will think that I am beautiful? Not so much that I will think I am beautiful.
Not about validating different forms of life. It's about saying the perfect human should be one who has perfected their own body in fitness or in health or whatever, which is all part of the process of marginalising the abnormal, the sick, the disabled, the elderly, even further than before. I think the creature isn't inherently evil, and that the novel, or Mary Shelley, is trying to criticise society in what it does to make people evil, for example, questions of poverty and things like that. But the reason why it comes back to the creature being evil due to his abnormality is that when he acquires knowledge, reading, writing, and even some of the sentimental moralities of the bourgeois of the time or even of the present, the fact that he is ugly or looks deformed makes the two incompatible, and it's that incompatibility that leads to the destruction of his own sense of self, which makes him evil.
It is the rejection by society and the way that people treat every overture by this creature to be accepted. That is what makes it a monster. Its actions are monstrous, but the monster is created by the way people treat it.
The monster is disabled literally, physically and emotionally and psychologically. In many forms he is disabled. The very nature of his body has enabled that he can be labelled that. But also as a symbol, he symbolises much of what disabled people feel, which is that marginalisation, that labelling as wretched. I think he says all people hate the wretched, in other words they all hate me. And as a disabled person you can associate with that as a symbol and as a reality.
I feel that this story has three protagonists, two men and science.
The scientist who discovers something new, the engineer who makes something new, the technology that alters how people live, how can that help but raise questions of, have you made a Frankenstein monster? It was H.G. Wells who was the first science fiction writer who consistently argued that technology changes society.
The core of what we do is actually work on not the simulation or not the vehicles or the physics or anything else here. What we're trying to do is build agents that behave as much as possible like people.
If something goes wrong, if those programs fail or misbehave, they can have dreadful consequences.
Sometimes feminists read this book as a kind of assault on certain stereotypical notions of masculinity. It's often read as an attack, a critique of male mastery, of male efforts at mastering the world. So that in such a reading, Frankenstein, the creator, as an attempted master of his creature, would become a kind of almost grotesquely parodic, grim, bleakly sardonic vision of every man who is macho and masterful and wants to create a kind of slave for himself and wants to control the world through controlling the very sources of life.
The men who invented the atomic bomb, and I use the word men very specifically here, were Victor Frankenstein, who for the best of reasons, the purest of intentions, created this thing that could blow up in our faces and destroy us. Once that genie was out of the bottle, they couldn't put it back in. All they could do was regret that the rest of their lives.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. A few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
And all the rest of us can do is live with it and hope that the genie never decides to go boom.
The military, which is one of the funders of the work here, not the only one, but one of the funders, they're very much interested in being able to train soldiers to be able to respond to various kinds of situations that they might encounter in a battlefield setting without having to actually recreate that with explosions and the like.
We have enough nuclear weapons on this planet to blow up the entire world, 40 times over or something like this. And it's all dependent. It's not my choice, and it's not your choice, and it's not the choice of, the viewers out there. It's the choice of a very few men who have placed their faith in technological systems. And if history has proven anything, it's that technological systems will fail.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up.
Technology is something that works at the moment. Without technology, and probably without genetic engineering in the future, we would not be able to feed the population of the world. Machines are getting more complicated, and I think they may have their own ideas one day as to what is a proper way for them to live.
Let's get physical, physical. I wanna get physical. Let's get into physical. Let me hear your body talk. Body talk. Let me hear your body talk. Let's get physical, physical. I wanna get physical. Let's get into physical. Let me hear your body talk.
I think that the fear comes in large part out of lack of understanding of the agents and what they actually do. And a particular area of research interest for me is building agents that can explain what they're doing and why, that you can enter into a dialogue with, so that they can talk to you about what they're doing in ways that you as a human can understand.
Well, today we can configure anything. We can morph two people into one. We can bring the dead back to life. I imagine, for instance, you could be surrounded in your own home by people you have admired throughout history. You can have screens on your walls, and you can populate your room with people you would wish to be with. They could be your family that are no longer alive. They could be people that you have admired in history. They could be animals. I have nothing against experiments, and an experiment can end badly. What I am concerned about is that those that make the experiments will take responsibility for the pieces, will take responsibility for the mistakes that are made in the course of those experiments. If you stop experimenting, you have to stop science. You cannot do that.
Hey, Professor.
The monster that modern society is creating, I think, is technology itself. While technology is really interesting, and I use technology to depict stories and myths, I feel like technology worldwide is getting out of hand.
We're not putting the genie back in the bottle. And whatever problems science and technology presents for the future, we've got to fix it with better science and better technology. She had a political mother and a political father, and it was impossible hanging out with Percy Shelley before she married him, and with Lord Byron. It was not possible for Mary Shelley to approach this work and not bring a political point of view to it. They were all interested in Rousseau's idea of the noble savage, which was a very popular notion at that time. And there's no question in my mind that Mary Shelley was trying to say in Frankenstein, here's what really happens if we bring the noble savage into existence. And he is up shit creek.
Mary Shelley is in effect offering us a political statement here. Victor Frankenstein goes off to the university in 1789, the year of the beginning of the French Revolution. The monster is created in 1793, the year of the Reign of Terror. In effect, a monster has been unleashed upon the world. What I'm trying to suggest, however, is that it's not merely a political novel, so that the monster can be seen as an embodiment of the French Revolution gone wrong. The monster can be seen as a child, or the child in us, or as any child. The monster can be seen as a product of the creative process of fiction.
Literally and literarily at the center of Frankenstein the novel is the monster's narrative. It can be read from a feminist perspective as Eve's narrative, as a woman's narrative about what it means to be woman and to have been, in some sense, abandoned, and to be alone with a desire for education, for learning, for companionship, and for a kind of fulfillment. At the same time, it can be read, and has been read, as a kind of existential parable about every human being. Mary Shelley herself read it that way, in which, when she used an epigraph from Paradise Lost, in which humanity says to the Creator, "Why did you abandon us?" But really, in some profound sense, the monster also speaks as a monster, for all those whom we consider monstrous. Anyone, any other, racial other, national other, sexual other, who is abandoned and betrayed by those who will not honor the internal consciousness, the being, the spirit, the soul of the other.
the creature is a kid. It's a big kid. That sense of being an outcast, we all have that. My gosh, sometimes we have that as adults. We certainly have that as kids.
I was not the typical child. I didn't like to go play baseball and basketball and play army with the other kids. I wasn't into sports. I didn't play with cars. I liked drawing and making my little monsters. So I kind of was that outcast. That kid that was strange, that lived down the street, that wasn't quite like the other ones. So I empathized with the monster. And I kind of, I think we had a certain bond because of that. And I also wore these big boots that were built up like this. No, just kidding.
Your family might be a little different or strange or not, quite of the social strata or the financial strata that the other people, who live around you, think they should be. It's ridiculous, but people do get ridiculous that way, don't they?
You see all of these homeless people who people are afraid of because they don't want to get dirty. They don't want to have to deal with this person's hunger or this person's problem. Yeah, I see a real tie-in with our modern outcasts and Frankenstein. People don't understand these people. They don't want to understand them. They want to live in their own sheltered lives.
Them that's got shall get. Them that's not shall lose. So the Bible said, and it still is news. Mama may have, Papa may have, but God bless the child that's got his own, that's got his own.
I felt like an outsider because I was brought up being told I was ugly, I was dumb, I was stupid, I was no good for nothing, I don't even know why you're here. I grew up believing all this stuff. And so that's who I became. And then I turned to alcohol and drugs. I became this violent, evil person.
The creature is the one that is, the other, that is, and that can be sublime, that can be lofty, and that can be incredibly moral, or that can be incredibly violent and disturbing beyond our capacity to reason with it. This is all in us.
In my mind, I would be screaming, it's like, you don't know me. It's like, who am I? Like, you don't even know who I am, and yet you label me. And it's frightening.
Well, there's always an outsider in any society. There's always a feeling of being out of control. When the monster realizes who he is, what he looks like, and the feeling of losing the control of who he thought he was, and wondering about his own identity, to me that reminds me very much of when you feel like your body has rebelled against you, whether it's with AIDS or cancer, or it's your body. You've lost control of that, and it's turning on you, and you feel just absolutely excluded or outside, or that you're two parts. Your soul is not one with your body.
Somehow I was led into meeting these here new people, living a sober way of life. And to me, it was like I had a second chance.
The moment when Victor Frankenstein decides not to create the bride of Frankenstein and to leave Hollywood filmmakers that job later on is really a very crucial moment in the novel, because that is the moment when the monster really definitively decides that he has to take his revenge.
The authorial point of view is very clear that the great crime of Victor Frankenstein is that he betrays this creature he brings into the world. like a parent turning its back on a child, and then he betrays the monster a second time. He is afraid of a race of monsters.
The greatest fear of otherness is its potential to breed and therefore dominate the world. When Victor Frankenstein kills the fellow creature that he's constructing in the Orkneys, of all places, he highlights the true fascist nature of the novel. I think the novel doesn't challenge the notion that abnormality is inherently evil or inherently bad. I think it plays along with the idea that the disabled or abnormality should be destroyed. I think it has elements that leave it open to reading it that it is being positive, but the fact that they all come from the monster and that he is also a psychopath and evil undermines everything positive about it.
The slave, the monster, who had been at the mercy of his creator because of his need for a companion, has now abandoned all hope of that and therefore becomes, in a certain sense, the master of his master. And there's a very elaborate kind of interaction between the two, which issues in that final terrifying journey across the ice, when we know that Frankenstein meets his end, that is Frankenstein the creator, but we really never find out what happens to the monster.
We know in the movies, no matter what we see that happens to the monster, we know it's coming back. Well, at the end of the novel, we do not see the monster destroyed. The monster says he intends to do self-immolation, but the last we see of him, he's on a chunk of ice, floating off into the darkness, and so far as I can tell, he's still breathing.
To read that the creature may not die at the end is a far too liberal reading, and I think one generally follows the directives of the novel itself and believes in its authority, and I think we do believe, or we are left to believe, that the creature will die at its own hands in the North Pole. Or even if it does live, it will remain there in the bleakness of the North Pole, which is the equivalent of death, as it will not be mixing with other human beings. I quite like the creature in that I can empathise with him and the way he's treated, but I dislike the way he is used to validate normality above abnormality, and I'm in the business of trying to validate abnormality.
I've got you under my skin.
Society gave the monster such a hard time about not having an identity that it's funny that society came through for the monster in the end.
In my heart, that you're really a part of me.
The monster has appropriated the doctor's name, and that's the ultimate revenge. The monster does have a name after all, and it's this fine old family name of Frankenstein.
Well, I am enormously pleased that this story was written because it has allowed us to have a debate about difference.
I think one of the most fascinating things and one of the most striking things about this book, for those who are reading it for the first time, is the discovery that the monster's exterior does not match his interior, that the monster is actually a sweet guy until he's made into a bad guy.
I visualise him as being very disabled, being very ugly, very much sort of in the Elephant Man mould, but a bit fitter.
High school students in the United States read Frankenstein. College students read it. People read it at the beach. Frankenstein is universally popular, and of course it's partly a consequence of James Whale and the Hollywood phenomenon, but wherever we look, we see Frankenstein.
I mean, every time you turn around, there's another Frankenstein movie, and there always will be. It's probably one of the most cinematic ideas of all time, and it is probably because of the metaphor. Film itself is a Frankenstein operation. You take little bits and pieces of film, and you splice them together, and then you put lightning into it. Well, maybe you don't do that.
Boris Karloff said that he was very pleased with his presentation of the monster because he heard from children all around the world, particularly Australian boys and girls, and they said, we knew you weren't mean, Mr. Monster, you know, just everybody picked on you, they threw things at you and all that, you know, we'd do mean things too if people picked on us.
My own creatures don't terrify me at all. How can I say this without sounding like a maniac? You know, it's, you know, I was going to say they're my children, you know, but it's like a line from some bad horror movie. But they are something that I've created, you know, and they have a magic to me.
Many of us already have quite a lot of metal in our bodies. Others of us hope to have some metal in our bodies as our bodies deteriorate. And some of us hope one day to have 1 or 2 chips implanted in our brains to perhaps help us think.
I just hope that someday in my lifetime I can create something that lasts, you know, that's an image in people's head like the Frankenstein's monster. You know, I mean, I think if I get anywhere near, you know, something that's half as recognizable as that, and somebody goes, oh, you know, I know what that is, then I would feel like I was successful.
The only way a work of literature becomes part of myth is to be diluted into the popular culture. You should be so lucky. You know, a work of literature that is not diluted has blown it. And the more variations that happen from a work, the more the work is borrowed from and copied and parodied and used and exploited and taken apart and put back together, to use some Frankenstein imagery, the better off that work is in terms of having made a lasting impression on the culture. Frankenstein is now part of Western civilization and will remain so, so long as this civilization lives.
Stay for the night. Or maybe a bite. I could show you my favorite obsession. I've been making a man with blonde hair and a tan, and he's good for relieving my tension. I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. Hey, I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. So, come up to the lab and see what's on the slab.